Now, students from white working-class backgrounds are less likely to do well in school than black and Asian pupils with equal disadvantages. This according to a report by the Education Select Committee. It's a problem the committee says is real and persistent and cannot be excused by poverty alone.
There are no excuses, and we can make a huge and transformative difference to poor children if we improve the quality of schools, if we increase the incentives to deploy the best teachers to provide education for the children from most challenging circumstances.
Well, joining us here in the studio, a head teacher who works at the coalface with this issue every day. Seamus Murphy is the head teacher of Dartford Technology College in Kent. Seamus, thank you so much for coming in. Now, I know you've spent much of your career, not just here in Kent, but in London as well, with disadvantaged children. Why do you think children from white working class backgrounds are struggling?
I think it's a very complex issue. There are a number of reasons that I would start off by saying I think the first thing, there's been an enormous change in the workplace. I think the young people who are leaving school today are facing a greater challenge than maybe certainly my generation and many of the challenges their parents faced. I think there still is a phrase called poverty of aspiration, where parents who may have not had particularly positive experience of education themselves, who see their own success based on having left school with some qualifications and been successful, and they're unable to translate that sort of past understanding to the present and say, well, actually, our students and our children need to stay on in school longer, need to have a wider range of qualifications, and need to think about possibly, tertiary education, going to university or going to further education and training. But it is complex because it isn't as simple as saying, there is this link between poverty, low aspiration, therefore the children don't succeed.
Well, not least because actually children from other ethnic groups who may be as disadvantaged are not doing as badly in school. Now, how do you explain that?
Well, I think there's been some really interesting initiatives that London has led on, and London Challenge, which I worked in a number of schools involved in that, and London Challenge had to grasp a simple fact. At the end of the sort of 1990s, large numbers of children from black and minority ethnic families were not achieving. And some of the London schools, or some of the ones I worked in, had over 80% of the cohort were on free school meals, an indicator of deprivation. And so something had to change, and there was a lot of energy and a lot of expertise to put into that.
So that worked. Clearly it worked.
Yes,
so do we need something similar to happen for white working class children here in Kent and Sussex?
Well, I think there's been a great change, and I would say that Sir Michael Wilshaw has been leading the charge on this for educational leadership. And I think this is the greatest challenge for educational leaders and schools to face. And I think there's been a lot of very, very positive work being done in schools and also by government. And I think the pupil premium is a good example of how funding is being directly attached to students from deprived backgrounds.
I mean, as a headline, it looks great, doesn't it? But when you look at some of the details, for each of the last 5 years, the South East as a region has had the country's biggest disparity in GCSE attainment between children on free school meals and those not. So essentially, children who get the pupil premium brought in and the ones who don't. The difference is consistently around 33%. That's evidence of the pupil premium not working in the South East, isn't it?
Well, I think the pupil premium is a relatively recent policy. But you've also got a very dynamic teaching force in London and an approach to leadership. And that is extending, so things like Teach First are coming into the South East, and there is definitely a sea change in the approach of head teachers in the South East, and there's been a change in leadership. And I think the schools are now definitely grasping this issue, but they are going to be 2 or 3 years behind the curve in terms of what's taken place in London. You've also got to remember the London Challenge started quite in a small number of schools in 2000, and it took quite a long time for it to generate the changes that we see now. But for me, some of the issues around this in the South East is around low expectations from teachers, low expectations from head teachers in the past. My own school went into special measures when I took it over just in 2011. There were two factors that contributed to that judgment that the school was inadequate. was the low achievement of students on free school meals and the low achievement of white British students. And it had not been a factor in the previous leadership's understanding of how to run the school, and I think that's that has changed enormously.
Okay. Let's bring our guests in. I mean, if I had plenty of time, and I'm sure you're both interested to hear what Seamus Murphy has to say, and I know you're both very interested in education. Claire, you trained as a teacher. Amber, I know you're very involved in the academies in Hastings. What do you think needs to happen? Let's start with Hastings. There have been some improvements in achievement with the schools in Hastings. What do they still need to do?
Well, this report that's just come out is a response to Michael Wilshaw's report, Unseen Children, which came out about 6 months ago. And in fact, Hastings was considered within that. And one of the things I discussed with Ofsted afterwards is the fact that we have made in Hastings quite significant improvements since then. But there is a lot more to do. And I do think that one of the great changes that's taken place in Hastings is some great new leadership, and also we've managed to attract some new teachers. And the fact is that, you know, when teachers graduate, they need to think that they're going somewhere where they're going to make a difference and it's going to be an exciting place to live and work. And Hastings is becoming that sort of place. We've attracted Teach First, which have come in for the first time and are sending teachers to our schools, and that creates an additionally positive atmosphere.
As you know, I know somebody who's a senior teacher in one of the schools you're close to, and she tells me that one of the problems now is the primary schools, that actually they're going to have to go in and do some hard work with the primary schools because the kids coming in at primary level are not at a high enough standard.
And she is absolutely right. And in fact, I go even further and say the early years is actually, and the report indicates this, is where the gap starts. It starts even before primary schools, which is why I'm so pleased that the government is expanding the pupil premium to disadvantaged 2-year-olds as well. So we want to get them as early as possible to make the difference. But primary schools have also improved and are also making progress under the new academy status. So I'm hoping they'll keep up with the improvements in secondary.
Claire, you trained as a teacher. There's an issue here, isn't there, about retention, about getting the best teachers to stay in areas where we need them?
Absolutely. I think we do need to incentivise teachers to come to areas where great teaching is needed, and I'd like to look at following on from the London Challenge with the Coastal Challenge. But just to pick up on a point that Amber made about getting in at the early years, that's why I think it's such a great shame that this government at the moment is cutting things like Sure Start's children's centres, where we know that that makes such a big difference to families and to young children, to stop that gap being in place before they start school. Also cutting things like connections and careers advice, because I think young people often don't see a world beyond their own experience.
Well, this is the point that Seamus was making. But, and if I may very briefly go back to this idea of parents. Seamus, can teachers really cut through where parents are totally disengaged in their child's education?
I think you can. I think, as I said, it's a complex issue, and there are in a time of austerity, there have been a number of services around challenging families who may not be engaging with school, and that has had an impact on making it in some ways our job harder. However, at the end of the day, you know, when I stand at my school gate every morning and I say hello to the parents and say hello to the children, there's a fundamental fact. All those parents send their children to school thinking they're going to do well that day.
Yeah.
Even the parents who have had negative experiences themselves, they come in there. That's the wonderful thing. Every morning they come in, it's a new day, a new start, things are going to go well. They don't always go well, and that's when there is a need for a range of strategies to engage and support some of these parents in terms of managing expectations. So an obvious example is homework. We know that some children who are disadvantaged don't have space, internet access, all the sort of, you know, the things that would make homework straightforward.
Okay, I'm going to have to leave it there, but it's been a real pleasure. Seamus, thank you very much indeed. It's time now for a round